Hello and welcome to today's webinar on the cloud. Hosted today by Preferred Solutions, and I'm Thiaan. So what we're going to cover today is a couple of the common issues we find out in the cloud, with our customers, of common misconceptions about what the cloud is, how you're using it, what else it can do for you, and we're going to discuss a couple of tried and tested scenarios of cloud that you can deploy or employ. After this webinar, please feel free to book some time with one of our Preferred Solutions consultants or with Preferred Solutions pre-sales. We'll be very happy to discuss your own scenarios and things that you can do with the cloud for yourself. Also look out for our future webinars. In the invite to this webinar, you'll see there's a link to subscribe to our mailing list for webinars specifically, and then to suggest any topics or ask any queries afterwards. Please feel free to email us at marketing@prefsol.co.za. Okay, so without further ado, let's talk about what is the cloud. Now, the first thing to understand is that the cloud is not one thing. It's not a place. You can't drive to somewhere where there's a computer and that computer is hosting or has the cloud on it. It's not something you can install. In effect, there's no real one definition of what the cloud is. Yeah, sure, if you go to places like Wikipedia and Google, you'll find definitions, but it's very important to understand that the cloud is it's just a concept of using the internet to make yourself location or make your computer systems that you're using location redundant, and that could mean many things. But what the purpose of this webinar is to address specifically the fact that the cloud does not imply security, redundancy, always on, or work from anywhere. And you'll see that I'm going to harp on this topic quite a lot through this webinar, because oftentimes, we get to customers who have now got encrypted or now lost data, and they said they thought they were protected, so they didn't back up or they didn't read the fine print because they were on the cloud. And it's, again, the cloud does not necessarily imply any redundancy, any safety. Oftentimes, it has to be said that oftentimes the cloud is actually more secure than hosting a traditional on-premise solutions, but that comes with a big citation needed, right? Big asterisk. So it can be more secure, but you have to understand the fine print. So let's unpack that a little bit. So we're going to look at the terms that's used commonly when we talk about the cloud. We're going to look at a couple of scenarios and trends in certain ways of employing the cloud options. And afterwards, this should make a lot more sense to you. So the jargon, the common things that you're going to be reading out there, or people are going to be dropping these acronyms in your conversations. The big one are these AAS abbreviations. So you've got EAS, PAS, SAS or SAS, and then BAS or BAS, whatever you want to call it, and then serverless computing and function as a service, or FOSS. Now, it always stands for as a service, something as a service, and it's very important, this little acronym. It means something, and that, again, I'm already starting to hop on it, right? So if we talk about infrastructure as a service, it physically means that, and we're going to unpack these things a little bit more. So you've got infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, backend as a service, or what's now sometimes referred to as mobile backend as a service, serverless computing, and function as a service. And obviously, full disclosure, we at Preferred Solutions do ERP projects. Amongst other things, we do accounting software and payroll software as the cornerstone of the services we deliver. So everything going forward will have a little bit of a flavor I'm going to assume that you know Preferred Solutions if you already know us because of our accounting ERP services that we provide. And we'll talk a little bit about how there are already some options available for you in every single one of these stacks. So just to, again, maybe put that a little bit more visual, if we look at how we run solutions, we start at the left-hand side of this slide. You'll find your traditional on-premise solutions, and that's typically, 10 years ago, that's the only place we would be working, is on-premise, at a desk, at work, and connecting to a desktop computer where all the data is locally. A trend that we're finding now is very, very popular, and that's where we have hosted servers. And I separated hosted server out into its own silo here, and we'll touch on that a little bit further as we go on. But ultimately, with a hosted server, you could argue that it's infrastructure as a service, because you're getting a physical machine that's in the cloud that you can connect to. But arguably it could also be platform as a service, and I'm going to unpack to you how there's a distinction and what the distinction is. The further we go to the right on this slide, the further we go away from actually being dependent on hardware for the features that we get out of our software. Because let's face it, at the end of the day, all hardware is about what we run on it and the software we use on it. Whether it is your accounting software or your operating system or the software you use on it. So let's say Facebook, for example. Facebook has always been a software as a service. We've never been able to install an application that's Facebook. And similarly, on the right hand side of this slide, when you use Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, for that matter, you'll only ever just consume what the software does, but totally oblivious to what lies under that, and what YouTube or Google or whoever has to invest in platform and infrastructure to make that web service or that software as a service work for you. A new trend in the market, and obviously everything can be unpacked a lot more, but a relatively new thing in the market is what we call function as a service, and this is becoming really popular, where we look at robotic process automation, AI, and machine learning as a service. And this is where we now have the benefit of the platform, software, and big computing power to start automating processes for us. Okay, so let's zoom in a little bit on each one of these silos and unpack the cloud ones on here. So if we again look at infrastructure as a service, this is where you're computing. It typically is computing, storage, security, and backup that's in the cloud. So it could be a firewall that is rented and that traffic is routed to. It could be just a backup service or storage where you pay them for the storage of something or computing. Typically, infrastructure as a service excludes operating systems and the software that is needed to reach that end goal. And you would typically have to still buy some sort of operating system softwares, and that's for you to license. The next one here is platform as a service. Now typically platform as a service is where like for example where you have a hosted server, but in this case typically your licenses and software will be included, disaster recovery will be included, and this could be your computer in the cloud. But do you see now how I meant that hosted service, a hosted server, I almost have to say as a separate option here, because whether you're on an infrastructure as a service or platform as a service, Typically platform includes things like disaster recovery, and you're divorced one further step away from the actual hardware. And that's why here again I harp on out for the fine print. Are you renting a box that's in somebody's data center, and if that box fails, and by box I mean computer, that's your problem and you need to get a technician out to fix it? Or do you have a virtualized server where there is the actual software of your server, your environment is running on, or virtually on, many servers, and there is redundancy from hardware failure? That will be explained to you in the fine print of that solution. Software service, this is now where we get to the pay-to-play space. So this is typically where the software is either free to use, like Google for example, but you actually just get the endpoint. You just see the application. Uptime, disaster recovery, access from anywhere is typically implied, but remember, somebody still has to manage that. If international bandwidth breaks, then our Twitter feed stops working because we don't have local service, for example. And that was the issues we were having recently with, for example, Twitter. A good example is also what happened to Sage 1 in the beginning of the year, where their servers crashed or had to be upgraded, and that meant that there was some downtime for some of the end users. Just the point there is, remember that even with software as a service, there is servers and infrastructure somewhere that somebody is managing it. So if you are running mission critical solutions, be sure to understand what is included in your license with them. That's a big thing here would be open source backends and open source software solutions in the cloud. It's incredibly important to understand where your data is, what are your uptime guarantees, and who's responsible for uptime. So another way of putting that is in this slide. This is a common way of depicting the differences between these silos. And on the left here again you've got on-premise, traditional IT, and yellow means that you managing and are responsible for a certain feature. And on the right hand side, let's call this color red for argument's sake, we've got software as a service, and red means managed by vendor. So on the left, from the bottom, you've got networking, storage, servers, virtualization, operating systems, middleware, runtime, data, and applications. And on-premise, you are responsible for all of that. Yes, you can buy SLA with an IT company and they start managing this for you. But traditionally and by default, that's something you have to add on. And then again, you can see here that I've got hosted server here as a separate one. This would be typically, if you look at something like Hetzner, or what they call themselves now, Xnielo or Terraco, where you can just rent a box in their data center. It's always super cheap. You get a server for 2,000 Rand a month. But if you don't understand that's still a physical machine, all they're giving you is you can rent some space in their data center, and they plug your server into their data center for you. If a hard drive fails on that, your server goes down and you have to get one of their technicians to go replace that for you. You typically still have to buy Windows for that machine, and you still have to install and manage your runtime and operating systems and your end user computers, so end user experience I should say. Then you get to what we call true infrastructure as a service. So this is typically where everything up to virtualization is included in that license or in that service. What virtualization means in this context is the let's call it the separation of the actual software from the operating system up and the hardware. So think about it as installing a clone of yourself on the same hardware, or let's call it bipolar, a bipolar person. You can have two personalities in one body, and that's what the visualizations allows you to do, is create these multiple personalities on one physical hard drive, or hard set of hardware, I should say. Again, once it's virtualized, you still have to buy operating system and software and middleware, so like Remote Desktop or TS Plus, to connect to the box, and license those softwares, and install your actual applications that you're going to run. And then Platform as a Service just includes everything, usually up to runtime. So now this is where your operating system is included, and your remote desktop licenses are typically included. You just have to, so it's still a Windows machine. You just have to install your application, so let's call it Sage 200 or Sage 50, and start using it in the cloud, and via usually something like Remote Desktop. On the infrastructure and hosted service, we have quite a lot of success with things like not TeamViewer, but TS Plus or Microsoft Terminal Services. They're very great connecting tools. Then again, on software as a service, you can now see that now your data and your application, everything is managed by your vendor. You just typically go into a browser, open up an application, a website, log in, and do the functions. So like with Microsoft Business Central, which is our true cloud ERP, or Sage 1 or 0, there's nothing to install. You just go to their web page, log in, and start processing. Okay. So the other three things that are that was in the jargon that's not on these slides are now what we call serverless computing or hyperscale. And this is in your bigger data centers and data providers like Azure or Google Cloud Platform, GCP, or Amazon Web Services or AWS, and even somebody like IEntry, where you can actually, the actual server that you're renting and the hardware of it is totally virtualized, and oftentimes you can set up things like scheduled scalability. So at month end, you know that you're going to need more spec from this hardware, so you can double your spec. And that's the important thing to visualize when you get to platform as a service, and then hyperscale. Imagine being able to upgrade a computer, memory, hard drive, processing, and all sorts of performance specs by logging into a software portal and sliding a slider. That's exactly what this means. Elastic and scalable just means that this machine can figure out when you need more resources and allocate those resources automatically, or as I'd like to say, automagically. We'll cover a bit more on this in the future, on future webinars. Function as a service is, I usually say, it's relatively new. This is quite a cool way of getting some quick wins in the cloud, and one that we find very popular at the moment is something like Azure SQL, where you can actually just rent a SQL Server as a service, and migrate your data up there and connect to it via something like Sage Evolution. But also think IoT, it's a very popular thing, Internet of Things at the moment, and you can actually have with Microsoft Azure IoT Hub, so you can have devices pushing data to IoT Hub, and then from there have that function of calling other services or APIs. The backend as a service would then be what I would determine as a cloud-based API. Very popular. We're having a lot of success with this with our true cloud solutions like Business Central, Microsoft Business Central. And imagine, this is where a car speaks to a service system via the internet, or an asset speaks to your backend directly. Okay, so let's look at a couple of scenarios. And in these scenarios, the important considerations are that I am going to highlight is what happens in a disaster. How do we recover from disaster? What are the points of failure? What are the links in the chain that could stop me from accessing the platform? What happens if hardware fails? What happens if I get attacked by malware? And where is my data? And the place to begin here would be in hybrid concepts, hybrid cloud concepts, and this is where you use the cloud or the internet in a portion of the solution, but not everything is up in the cloud. Something we're having a lot of success with at the moment is something called Evolution Anywhere. This is 4-stage evolution, and this is a VPN service. It's basically your middleware and your VPN in one. So what happens is you'll have an application server, so Evolution will be somewhere, and this could be hosted. So it could be a platform as a service server or hosted server, or it could be still in one of your offices. You install Evolution anywhere. Now your computers and your branches access one server via this service. So that you're still accessing it via the cloud, but you have remote use. So think about a remote aeroplane. Is you're just literally looking at what it's doing, and then have a keyboard locally that can make it go up or down, or faster or slower. And that's effectively what something like Evolution Anywhere is. So again, in terms of those considerations, points of failure, remember now all hardware is potentially risk, because if with Evolution Anywhere you will have servers and end user computers that just connect via locally. Yes, you can still host some of it, so you can host your head office server, for example, and again, remember when I speak about a hosted server, it could either be infrastructure or platform as a service, which implies more or less support on the device, right? Internet connection on both ends. If it fails on the server side, you can't connect. If it fails on the end user side, you can't connect. Your virtualization, and obviously the hardware is an issue here. High latency typically tends to be a pain here. So again, if you're flying the airplane and it takes a second for you to for when you give the throttle up command to when the plane gets it, there could be some frustration around that, right? Disaster recovery, typically self-managed. If the server fails, still an on-prem server, typically you still have to manage it. Yes, remember that little citation. If you hosted the server, then you have to figure out what is the hosting partner giving you with it. The big pro here, and the big reason for going with this, is it maximizes your return on investment of existing infrastructure. So if your servers are coping, and your end user computers are all fine, nobody has to learn new software, nobody has to buy new hardware. All you do is you install Evolution Anywhere, and you immediately have access from anywhere. And that's the big pro here. It gives you access from anywhere. And the examples here are Evolution Anywhere, that's one we like a lot. TS Plus is very good, and MS of Microsoft Terminal Services. Typically with these two, you'd want another server, so that affects the pro here of maximizing a return, right? So you might want to, in this case, have a separate application server to stop your users from actually working on the server where the data is. And that's an important thing to also take into account when you have any cloud hosted server or platform as a service environment. Remember, people are still now logging into it. So if you only have one server and your data is on the same machine, you're still vulnerable to malware. That segues nicely into where we've got the hybrid cloud, but in this case we've got a cloud application server. And again, we might want to structure that in terms of having an application server and a data server. But effectively now all your users are connecting directly to your cloud server, and remote controlling, like we were just speaking about Evolution Anywhere, remote controlling the machine in the cloud. Now, if you take those considerations into account, it's very important to read the fine print again, because of what I've been hopping on all along. Infrastructure, platform as a service, more or less will be included by default from the supplier, and some of the services you need to buy as add additional purchase. So disaster recovery with Xnelo, for example, is usually an added service. It's not that it's a bad thing, it's just is that if you think you're going to buy the cheapest one, you don't read the fine print, and the hard drive fails, that was actually your hard drive because you just basically have a higher purchase agreement with them for the hardware, and then they put it on their network for you and give you access via the internet. So hardware is self-managed, malware is self-managed. You have to install antivirus on that machine, and it's very easy to have this false sense of security. Big pro here, the reason to do this is a rapid deployment of existing applications to the cloud. So if you use TS Plus or Microsoft Terminal Services with the remote apps, you can actually even run something like Pastel Partner or Sage Evolution in a browser. Yeah, sure, it skins it up for you, and so it still looks the same, but you can access it from anywhere. You can access it on tablets, and you can have really cool solutions around it. So your end users don't need to learn new software, and that's in the cloud very quickly. Again, read the fine print. You have to understand what you're getting yourself into. Okay, then we've got the true platform as a service, or hypercloud. It's exactly the same as we discussed earlier. It's just in this case we use hyperscale cloud platforms like Azure or AWS, where they just give you a virtual machine as a service. Something we're having a lot of great success for a great price point is something called IEntry. We all know them from the backup world that they've been doing for us with the Sage for many years. They also now host servers, and they include fully managed disaster and hardware options for us. In all of these scenarios, your only point of failure typically is the internet connection on your end user side. Yeah, in theory a data center can go offline, but typically they are replicated and they can do hot swap. So if one data center goes offline, you typically as the end user won't even recognize it. Okay, so let's read the fine. So again, important to understand the fine print. Malware, again, you're still logging into a machine that's in the cloud. It still is self-managed. So if a user has admin access, you don't have antivirus on it, you could still encrypt that server, right? You can still have issues with viruses on that machine. Typically, in your disaster recovery SLA or the terms in that contract, so for something like IEntry, they can rebuild a server for you from the last backup point within minutes. So the moment you realize you have an issue, then 5 minutes later you can have restored and continue working. It does not necessarily mean you're not going to lose data, but it means that it's managed for you. Okay, and then you obviously have true software as a service and true cloud, and this is typically, if we speak about the cloud, in my mind where I go to is software as a service. So that's where you now only work with a solution through a website or through the application itself, and this is where the world is going to, right? Your points of failure again here is only the end user side. If you can't connect, you need a failover connection. You just need to be connected to the internet. Disaster and hardware is managed for you, and maybe important to understand, like with Sage 1, we probably could have asked them, what is your upgrade schedules and policies, but it's typically not something that we'd consider as an end user. I mean, the pros here is, again, fully managed, pay to play, and your cost of ownership. If in any of the other scenarios, the moment you start taking into account what the software costs you and the platform costs you, then software as a service would typically be cost competitive every single time. And to put into perspective, Microsoft Dynamics 365 Business Central, which is a cloud ERP, a true cloud ERP that we do at Preferred Solutions, is cost competitive with a Pastel Partner single user that's on-prem. The moment you start taking that infrastructure and the hardware into account, it becomes quite a interesting calculation. Examples of this would be our Sage Business Cloud Accounting, which is coming out and getting a big upgrade at some point in this year. It was supposed to be April this year, but you know, we'll keep tabs on that. Sage Business Cloud Payroll, which is available, is very good. Xero. Office 365 is a great example of this, where you can have your Active Directory or email in the cloud and actually even have a cloud domain. Talk about going to the cloud, right? Okay, so the emerging trends, and we've touched on these quite a bit. So Evolution Anywhere is the one where we spoke about, where it gives you a virtual network over the cloud. Then we've got Hyperscale Cloud, which like IEntry, AWS, Azure, and GCP. We've got hybrid on-prem, like, and that's so maybe a bit of a misnomer after you understand everything we've just covered, but this is where we can use function as a service. So for example, install Sage Evolution or Sage 200, but keep the SQL database in a true cloud function as a service. Really cool solution, and it gives us that database redundancy. And then we've got our true cloud SaaS, which we now spoke about. The great thing here to look out for is what Microsoft is doing in the world. They are taking the world by storm and spending billions on things like robotic process automation, AI, and what they call insights. If after this, if you've got Office 365, go click on the Insights button in your Outlook. It'll blow your mind what it can do for you. Okay, so just in summary, we'll get back to this slide. So in your mind, that we've got these silos. You are plotting somewhere on here from left to right. Go back to how your network is set up at the moment, how your infrastructure is set up, and your ICT is set up at the moment, and go put every feature, every function that you have into one of these silos, and then decide what the strategy is. You know, you can even have telephony as a service nowadays, where you can have voice over IP switchboards. That's totally virtual, and on the right hand side of this. So for everything where there's communication or internet or systems and processes, it makes sense to have a strategy to get you down to software as a service, because again, remember, yeah, features are great, usually better because it's more cutting edge, but with cutting edge comes pain. The other side of that coin is cost. So cost, it doesn't make sense to spend hundreds of thousands of rands on servers anymore if you can just rent a service at a fraction of the cost. Okay, thank you again for your time today. If there are any questions, I know that this is now a recorded webinar, please feel free to email us either at marketing@prefsol.co.za or sales@prefsol.co.za. Thank you for your time.